They can be beautiful, fragrant, even a centerpiece in your yard. They can also be dangerous and can choke out your garden, pastures, crops, or state and federal lands. They can be an enemy force that invades and occupies new lands. There's no concrete definition for all that a weed is, because in simple terms, weeds are plants that grow where they're not wanted. But not all weeds are the same. They can be invasive or non-invasive, native plants or non-natives. Some are legally targeted for control in the Pacific Northwest. Now these are the noxious weeds. The best thing you can do to fight these enemy invaders is to be aware of the noxious weeds and their impacts. Dr. Sarah Reichart is an assistant professor in urban horticulture at the University of Washington. She's an expert on invading plants and serves on the National Invasive Species Task Force, a national commitment to taking on this problem.
The ability of a species to invade compared to other introduced species when they don't invade, that the invasive species have a much higher reproductive output. The invasive plants are just really good reproducers. I recently heard someone say that doing nothing about a weed problem is doing something. It's allowing the invasion to spread, and that's really true. Invasive plants don't go away on their own. If we don't take action to control them, we know that they're going to become a much more serious problem in the future, and we're passing that problem on to our children and our grandchildren. We know that invasive plants are very competitive, and they outcompete native plants for resources such as soil, water, nutrients, pollinators, and dispersers. They also can be what we call ecosystem engineers, where they actually change the ecosystem by changing the water balance, by increasing fire frequency and intensity, or by increasing siltation.
To protect its resources in Washington, the legislature passed a noxious weed control law that establishes a state board, which in turn works with county weed boards. The goal of the state and county noxious weed boards is to protect the state from the introduction and spread of noxious weeds. The destructive and competitive nature of noxious weeds requires diligent efforts to control, contain, or eradicate invasive species. In the following video, we'll demonstrate the impact that some of the more common of these noxious weeds can have in the Pacific Northwest. We'll examine why they're successful and aggressive invaders. We'll discuss ways that each citizen of the state can become involved to play a critical role to keep the Pacific Northwest as noxious weed-free as possible. It was a common practice for families to bring a piece of their homeland with them when migrating to the United States. Ornamental plants from Europe and Asia were introduced to the Pacific Northwest as early as the 1800s. However, as pretty as many of these plants are, some are not entirely compatible with our environment. They outcompete native plant species that once thrived here. These ornamental plants are beautiful, but each is a problem in its own way. For instance, the lush, snake-like vines that seem to reach to the sky in the dark forests of the Pacific Northwest are one of these weeds. Believe it or not, backyard birds are largely responsible for the spread of this garden ornamental turned noxious weed, which severely alters biodiversity in our natural areas and parks. People are still purchasing English ivy in nurseries today. Bridget Simon is with the King County Noxious Weed Control Program.
A couple things about English ivy. When English ivy is mature, it stays in the vegetative stage and it just grows as a vine. But it takes about 9 years for the plants to mature, and when they mature, they start growing up surfaces, and that's when we notice them growing up the trees. At that time is also when they produce flowers and fruit. And birds are part of the spread of English ivy. What they do is they eat the fruit in the springtime when there's not another food source available to a lot of our wildlife, and that's how they end up bringing the plants to our natural areas. Once the English ivy gets into the natural areas, first thing it starts doing is crawling along the forest floor. And what it does down there is really a big impact, actually, because it's smothering out the understory plants. Even though that when we think of English ivy and English ivy impacts, the first thing that we usually think of is the impacts to our trees. A couple things about the impacts to our trees. Contrary to popular belief that the roots of the ivy, they don't actually penetrate the bark. The problem is that when ivy's young, it has axillary roots and it has little adhesive pads on its rootlets, so that helps it hold on to the tree. But once it starts climbing up to the tree and it gets mature, it no longer produces those rootlets. The impact to the tree is that ivy, once it gets to the tree, it just keeps growing. They pull down 2,100 pounds from a tree. When it gets that heavy, it collects ice, it collects water, it collects debris, and then when a windstorm comes along, it acts as a flag and knocks the tree down. Another thing about this plant, too, is that these garden plants, they live for a long time. There is reports of one plant living to be over 400 years old. So what can you do to help stop the spread of English ivy into our natural areas? The biggest thing you can do is to not buy it. The second thing you can do is, if you have it growing in your yard, just make sure that it doesn't produce flowers and seeds so that the birds don't spread it. And if you can remove it from your yards, that would be a great help too.
Another ornamental plant turned noxious weed is parrot feather, an aquatic plant frequently used in aquariums and in aquatic gardens. You can often find parrot feather covering irrigation ditches, shallow lakes, ponds, and riverbanks. Parrot feather is currently widespread in coastal areas from San Francisco to Washington, in California's Central Valley, and the Willamette Valley in Oregon. In Washington, major infestations are in southwestern counties, including the Chehalis River. Scattered populations can also be found in Puget Sound's lowland lakes, and has been reported east of the Cascades. Parrot feather has a dense mat of feather-like leaves and can stand as tall as 12 inches above the water. These mats of parrot feather lower the oxygen level and change the pH balance of the water, which alters the environment for aquatic invertebrates and fish. The weed restricts coastal stream flow and prefers to occupy fry-rearing habitats. Parrot feather mats also provide for perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes by calming open water. Infestations are also known to block water flow, which increases upland flooding. When the mats break free, they can clog intake pipes for irrigation and clog power plant generators. Thousands of dollars are spent each year removing parrot feather from areas of concern. This weed spreads only by breaking apart into smaller fragments. The rhizomes of parrot feather are known to be very resilient and can be transported over long distances on boating equipment. In fact, boats and vehicles can carry the broken fragments from lake to lake. Citizens play an important role in preventing parrot feather spread. You need to inspect boats, trailers, and jet skis when leaving a waterway where parrot feather occurs. Aquarium owners should also take caution when they are purchasing new aquatic plants and when discarding old plant material. They should be careful to bag the plant material and place it in the trash for proper disposal. Notify your county weed board if you suspect an infestation in a waterway. Some noxious weeds are more of a risk to humans than the environment. Giant hogweed, for instance, is a massive flowering plant. Initially, it was brought from Asia and planted in arboretums as a curiosity. It escaped and has since spread, particularly into riparian areas and urban sites. Laurel Shiner is an expert on giant hogweed.
This is a typical spot where you would find giant hogweed in an urban setting next to a stream bank. You'll also find it growing in gardens because it is planted as a garden curiosity. But giant hogweed contains a sap in the leaves and the stems, which when it comes into contact with the skin in the presence of sunlight can cause large weeping watery blisters. Now some of these blisters can leave permanent scarring and discoloration of the skin. As you can see, most of these flowers are pretty tall. A lot of them get up to 10 to 14 feet tall, the bigger ones do. We've got large leaves down at the bottom here and serrated along, jaggedy along the edges here. Some of them can be 4 feet wide and 5 feet long, so that's pretty big. Also has a large hollow stem with purple blotches along the stem, at the base of the stem, particularly down near the ground.
Giant hogweed grows well in rich, damp soils. It's well adapted to shady riparian areas, such as the banks of streams, rights-of-ways, parks, and other natural areas. It can outcompete native vegetation and quickly dominate ravines and stream banks. When it dies back in the fall, it leaves banks unvegetated and vulnerable to erosion. Giant hogweed is a challenge to control because the tuberous roots of the plant stay alive for years, and any seeds in the ground will continue to germinate. Currently, giant hogweed has been reported in 9 western Washington counties. Because it is a human health threat, it's targeted for eradication in Washington state. But there are still nurseries and seed companies that illegally sell giant hogweed. You should remove giant hogweed if you have it on your property or where your children play. But remember, the sap can cause a skin reaction, so make sure that you wear protective clothing and gloves if you are doing the removal. Native plants are the basis of the food chain of most wild animals. When noxious weeds crowd out native plants, they're ultimately causing a chain reaction that may result in serious hardships for wildlife and, in some cases, total collapse of the food web. Take Japanese knotweed, for instance. This import from Asia is still sometimes used as an ornamental in gardens. Despite its negative impact on the ecosystem, it can still be found in garden magazines. Japanese knotweed is an escaped ornamental that is becoming increasingly common along stream corridors and rights-of-ways in Washington. It's a large, robust perennial with stout, cane-like stems, and the plant can stand between 4 and 9 feet tall. Laura Potash is with the United States Forest Service. She has witnessed the invasion and detrimental impacts.
The Forest Service is really concerned about all of the noxious weeds. We're particularly concerned about Japanese knotweed because it's taking over our riparian systems, our river corridors. And right now we're trying to make a big effort to protect the endangered salmon. One of the ways we're trying to do that is to get forests to grow back along these riparian corridors. And if you have a thicket like this, that's just this dense monoculture of Japanese knotweed, you're not going to be able to get trees to grow there again. When I talk about Japanese knotweed, I'm actually referring to all the invasive knotweeds. We're still learning a lot about this genus, and we have Himalayan knotweed, giant knotweed, and they hybridize. So I may say Japanese knotweed, but I'm referring to any of the invasive knotweeds. Japanese knotweed spreads really fast. That's one of the big concerns. Mostly how it spreads is by these underground stems called rhizomes. All you need is a tiny piece, just a fragment, like a half a gram of a rhizome to grow a whole new plant. We had a botanist that worked for us once who took just a tiny piece, like no bigger than your pinky fingernail, and put it in a pot with some soil. And about 2 or 3 days later, she had a big knotweed plant, just like Jack and the Beanstalk. So the way that these rhizomes get around is partly, sometimes you have like heavy equipment doing earthwork, but when the knotweed's growing in riparian corridors, anytime there's a major flood, it just breaks off pieces of knotweed and spreads it downstream, and then you have a whole new infestation.
Japanese knotweed, as well as many other knotweeds, is a challenge to control. But this fight we must win. The blanket of sunflower-like plants you see lining the roadway when driving through the Pacific Northwest could be part of the hawkweed family. Linda Wilson is a crop and weed scientist at the University of Idaho. She specializes in management of invasive plants.
This plant is called meadow hawkweed. It's one of 6 invasive hawkweeds that we have. They all come from Central Europe. Some of them come from here fairly high elevations in the Alps. So they are adapted to habitats like you see here, forested habitats in the inland northwest, pastures associated with those habitats. In a forest situation, it really likes to hang out on the fringe of forested areas, and then when an opening occurs, either through logging or windfalls or wildlife trails or what have you, then hawkweeds can take over that site very quickly and then spread through the forest. Hawkweeds are very aggressive because they have many modes of reproduction. It displaces other plants predominantly through these stolons. These stolons allow hawkweed to come in as a single plant and create a vast, large clone of only hawkweed. And then it has many, many flower heads, and the seeds have burrs on them and a plume, much like a dandelion seed. And they can stay dormant in the soil. They can travel long distances. Seeds get caught up in the feathers of birds and the hair of livestock, in logging equipment, in recreational vehicles, and then get transported to create new infestations. And so typically what you see in a hawkweed infestation is at first hawkweed establishing amongst the community of vegetation, and then within 4 to 5 years that community being reduced to 1 or 2 species, hawkweed predominating.
In addition, because of the milky sap in the stems of hawkweeds, hawkweeds are unpalatable to livestock, and an infestation replaces quality forage plants. Finally, some people develop an allergy to hawkweeds. In 1936, this lovely seaside hamlet was razed by fire, all because of a weed that was once an ornamental. How the fire started is open to debate, but within hours, the inferno had consumed 484 of the 500 buildings that defined the town of Bandon, Oregon. This was due greatly to the large volume of flammable oils produced by the impenetrable gorse thickets in Bandon, and when combined with other dry matter in the city, created a devastating fire hazard. Today, the town has been rebuilt, and current growth of the community is, for now, outcompeting the gorse. Gorse invades infertile or disturbed sites, sand dunes, gravel bars, fence rows, overgrazed pastures, logged areas, and burned over lands. In Washington, gorse plants have become an increasing problem. Some surpass the size of small houses. Tim Wilson is the weed coordinator for Pacific County in southeast Washington. He has been working with gorse infestations for some years now.
Gorse adapts very well to poor, well-drained, sandy soils. It was established into southern Oregon and has moved up via water and via development up and down the coast, and usually ranges along the coastal areas. Gorse is a concern in southwest Washington for 2 reasons. The first reason is its invasiveness and its ability to create a fire hazard. The other reason that gorse is on the weed list is because of its ability to crowd out conifers and the forest species that are vital to the area. Another problem with gorse is the longevity of the seed. It's reported that the seed is viable from 25 to as long as 70 years in the soil. So it really turns into a matter of long-term control and maintenance. In many cases, the gorse is spread through development. The gorse is brought in via contaminated equipment or contaminated fill. Landowners can take great care to clean their equipment if they're developing a lot. They want to clean that equipment before it leaves the site. They also want to know where their soil's coming from, if they're doing any filling, to make sure that that soil isn't infested with gorse.
Roads and rights-of-ways are major corridors for weeds to travel on throughout the state. Rights-of-ways are issued for power lines, pipelines, railroads, access roads, communication sites, and other access and maintenance projects on public lands. Many of the state parks, city and county parks, landfills, and schools are located on leased public land. Many of the weeds we review in this video can be found on our roads and rights-of-ways, but some weeds travel a little more than others. Unlike gorse, its close relative, Scotch broom, was ignored in the Pacific Northwest for many years after its initial invasion and expansion. This plant is now one of the most common weeds in western Washington and is easily overlooked when not in bloom. It's moved rapidly into highway and road rights-of-ways, open landscapes, and forest openings in western Oregon and Washington. Like many noxious weeds, Scotch broom was introduced as a garden plant. Once Scotch broom becomes established in an area, it forces out the more desirable plants like forbs, grasses, and young trees. It has begun its expansion eastward across the Cascade Crest and has been found in isolated locations in eastern and northeastern Washington. Just to give a snapshot of the economic impacts, a report to the 2000 Oregon legislature estimated the cost to Oregon taxpayers due to Scotch broom infestations was $47 million a year, and impacts could be similar in Washington given current western Washington infestations. A Lincoln County resident actually had 7 plants growing in their yard, ripe for escape. The county weed board notified the homeowner about the legal need to eradicate the plants. A second landowner in northeastern Washington was notified they had Scotch broom on their forest property. Once the landowner was aware of the problem, they reported a second finding in an isolated location on a mountain ridge, and both populations were eradicated. These examples show the importance of both the weed board and the landowner taking responsibility for Washington lands. Another group of weeds that travel along our state's roads, rights-of-ways, and trails is the knapweed complex. 2 particularly undesirable members of that complex, spotted and diffuse knapweeds, have become commonplace, infesting nearly 500,000 acres east of the Cascades, with 90% of that infestation in the border counties with Canada. Recently, small and large knapweed infestations have been found west of the Cascades. Knapweed invasions can cause tremendous loss in forage lands, replacing 63% of grazing forage for livestock and wildlife. Cindy Roche is a private consultant and an expert in knapweed invasion.
Basically, spotted and diffuse knapweed can invade almost any disturbed area as long as the soil is well drained, and that eliminates everything basically but the swamps, and where there's enough sunlight for them. So dense shade under deep forest won't have knapweeds. But all the other areas, rights-of-ways along roadsides and railroads and power lines, vacant lots, even lawns that are abandoned and not very well cared for and grow knapweeds. Dryland, alfalfa hay, non-irrigated pastures, the whole gamut of open areas where knapweed can move in. Spotted and diffuse knapweed reproduce by seed, and they produce lots of seeds. In an area like this, the diffuse knapweed would be producing between 12 and 50,000 seeds per square meter. This whole plant breaks off at the base. It's kind of like a tumbleweed. It can roll in the wind and get carried along. If a vehicle drives over it, it can get lodged in the undercarriage. Or if this were growing along a creek or a river, it could fall into the river and float downstream.
The lesson learned from these knapweeds is to get control of them early in the infestation, because if they get a foothold, they will be economically impossible to control. People and animals are the primary movers of the weed species to new locations through contaminated shoes, tires, vehicles, contaminated forage, and gravel. Landowners, check your equipment. Passers-by, campers, and outdoorsmen, make sure you've not picked up part of a knapweed plant prior to leaving an area that is infested. Horse owners, be aware of infested manure if you take animals from areas where they may feed on infested forage. If you do happen to find a small patch, eradicate it right away. Another invader of our Pacific Northwest rights-of-ways and ag land in eastern Washington is Kochia. Introduced to the United States as an ornamental in the early 1900s, this Asian import escaped and quickly began to spread and infest our nation state by state. Kochia is an annual broadleaf plant that grows from 1 to 6 feet tall, branching out from the main stem. It poses a serious economic problem in crops such as potatoes, alfalfa, and wheat. Even though when quite young it provides good protein for livestock, once it starts to mature, it becomes rank and can cause livestock nitrate poisoning. Jerry Jenke is the Noxious Weed Board Coordinator in Grant County.
This plant, in my opinion, could be a problem anywhere in the state of Washington. It grows in dry land, it grows in irrigated, it grows in salty areas. So it doesn't seem to be the moisture, lack of moisture, a lot of moisture. It's not a real good competitor with grasses and good stands of different crops, but where it competes is when the ground is disturbed, or like the roadsides or a thin stand. It competes very well. This is not only a rural problem in the farms and on the roadsides, this is probably our biggest problem in Grant County again, in the lots in town. This is what we have tendency to have to get people to control more than anything else. But what this plant does, it keeps coming back and keeps coming back. It's like a boxer, keep getting knocked down and keep getting up, down and up. And this is what Kochia will do. It just keeps growing and growing. But it does not compete with good grass. So the whole secret is to have a good vegetation management program, and you're not going to have a problem with Kochia. But disturb the ground and leave it lay, I'll guarantee you the first thing you'll get is Kochia, at least in Grant County. So when people do have this Kochia problem, they need to talk to people in the know-how to find out what's the best way to control it.
Noxious weeds first received notoriety in the agricultural community. Weeds not only affect crop production, but weeds can also directly affect livestock. Many weeds take over lands that were once prime grazing areas. Some weeds even contain toxic compounds that can harm or kill an animal. In the U.S., noxious weeds result in approximately $27 billion in crop loss per year. Take Canada thistle, for instance. It's considered the scourge of farmers all across the U.S. The reason Canada thistle is so aggressive, so tenacious, and so difficult to control is that it spreads by both its seed and its root system. Canada thistle has a deep and extensive root system running horizontally as far as 15 feet or more. In fact, it's through this underground root system that Canada thistle primarily spreads. Any fragment of the root can start a new plant, and for this reason, tillage equipment is a major culprit for spreading fragments. Canada thistle infests fields, pastures, roadsides, and cropland, degrading and devaluing grain crops like wheat and barley by reducing yields and seriously impacting hay production and sales. Canada thistle reduces forage consumption in pastures and rangeland because cattle typically will not graze near infestations. As with most noxious weeds, infestations start on disturbed ground, including ditch banks, overgrazed pastures, tilled fields, or open waste places. This weed has been here for years and still expands where people do not actively manage populations. Canada thistle is the best example statewide of what happens when management efforts were not in place at the time of infestation and expansion. It's so widespread in the state that mandatory control is only required in areas of hay production due to the economic impacts of low-quality forage. We discuss Canada thistle not to advise to you that we need your help and assistance, but rather as an example of why the noxious weed board system is imperative in aggressively managing new invaders and expanders so that we do not have more statewide Canada thistle-like examples. Tansy ragwort is classified as a noxious weed in many states. Dr. John Flory is a veterinarian with Deschutes Animal Clinic in Tumwater, Washington. He understands the health risks to livestock from tansy ragwort.
I'm here to talk today about tansy ragwort. It's a fairly ubiquitous noxious weed and toxic plant in the locale that I practice in, as well as most of western Washington and it's most of the Pacific Northwest. The main way that tansy is toxic is it causes cirrhosis of the liver, specifically in horses and cows that are more prone to this toxicity than, say, sheep or goats. How horses and cows graze is usually in spring when the plants are growing, and the tansy plants, when the first seedlings come out, are called rosette stages that are small, compact plants that are against the ground. Horses and cows will indiscriminately prehend the grass by grasping it with their lips and chewing it and swallowing it, and will frequently not be able to detect the presence of the tansy rosette that is available to them in contaminated pastures. This poisoning accumulates over time. Even though an animal may eat a lethal dose in one feeding, it's not going to show its effects for months to even years. This does not allow the liver to work properly, and therefore you end up with an animal that can have a varied multitude of signs in coordination, actually acting toxic or intoxicated as if it was drunk because it's not able to metabolize its food properly.
Tansy ragwort is often found in disturbed ground and is accelerated in areas where other vegetation is sparse. For example, overgrazed pastures or fields with low fertility soils. Currently, tansy ragwort is primarily a problem on the west side of the Cascades. However, since it can survive under most soil moisture conditions, even hot, dry summers, it is slowly moving into eastern Washington. If this weed becomes established in the hay-growing areas of the state, there will be severe economic and animal health issues. One noxious weed that is a problem in U.S. winter wheat production is jointed goatgrass. This weed is closely related genetically to the wheat plant and has an identical growing season. The plants can even crossbreed. Getting ahead of this noxious weed is a real problem. Joe Yenish is a weed scientist with Washington State University and has been challenged with the goatgrass problem since he arrived in Washington.
The reason it's such a severe problem is really threefold. In other words, it's a triple threat. It has potential to compete with our winter wheat crop and result in a yield reduction which can be as severe as 50%, but in moderate to heavy infestation runs about 30% yield reduction. In addition to that, these spikelets or spikes disarticulate quite readily, looking like a little piece of wheat stem, and this will very readily show up in the combine bin after harvest. Contaminants in the harvested wheat are known as dockage, and there can be a very severe penalty when the farmer goes to market that crop when he has the dockage or contaminants. And the third thing, if you have jointed goatgrass as a contaminant in your wheat, your bushel weight, tested bushel weight, is going to decrease, and this is going to result in also a lower value for that crop. Total losses to wheat farmers in the Pacific Northwest and the Central and Southern Great Plains has totaled anywhere from in the hundreds of millions of dollars into the billions of dollars, and with the losses again being through reductions in yield, reductions in quality, and dockage due to contamination of the grain.
Goatgrass is not only found in wheat fields, but also in grasslands, along roadsides, fence rows, and other cropped and non-cropped areas. It seems that many producers are inadvertently spreading the jointed goatgrass through contaminated seed and equipment. Wheat seed growers need to ensure the seed they produce is weed-free, and the farmer needs to take care to manage their current infestation and not spread it any further. Noxious weeds are also a problem in our lakes, streams, and rivers. At first glance, they can be attractive and exotic. In some cases, there may even be benefits to these weeds' existence, such as increased fish habitat. Any benefits attributed to aquatic noxious weeds, however, are far surpassed by the damage they do to our marine life and our environment, as well as to our aquatic recreational pursuits. In some cases, an aquatic weed can reproduce quickly and invade an entire lake or pond. One such aquatic noxious weed is purple loosestrife. It grows in wetlands and along freshwater lakes, streams, rivers, and creeks, and will even tolerate some salt water. Purple loosestrife came to the northeastern seaboard of the U.S. in the ballasts of ships in the early 1800s. It sat on the coast for 100 years, acclimating itself to the new land before it started moving across America. It can now be found throughout the U.S. Purple loosestrife was also sold as a garden plant, although education and our noxious weed laws continue to help prevent or even stop this method of spread. Purple loosestrife showed up in the irrigation waterways of eastern Washington in the 1960s. It now covers 23,000 acres in a 50,000-acre wetland. This plant completely dominates a site. It disrupts wetland ecosystems by pushing out native and beneficial plants. Once the native plants are gone, this forces waterfowl, birds, and other animals to leave the area to seek food, nesting material, and ground cover elsewhere. Why did it take over? Well, it spreads mainly by seeds, an amazing 2.7 million seeds per plant. But it also spreads from the buried stems that harbor little buds that produce shoots or roots. Because of all of its reproductive strategies, the key to controlling purple loosestrife is diligence. Prevention is the key option for keeping this invasive plant out of many wetlands in Washington that do not have purple loosestrife. While purple loosestrife is still found in gardens, continuing education is helping to let others know how it is a problem for wetland plants and animals when this plant escapes from gardens. Even though it's possible to find purple loosestrife for sale or available through the internet, it is illegal to buy, sell, or offer for sale any purple loosestrife or purple loosestrife cultivars in Washington. Fragrant water lilies are one of the most easily recognized of all the aquatic plants. Beautiful, large white or occasionally pink, many-petaled flowers float on the water surface surrounded by large, round green leaves. These plants are often seen in backyard ponds and are seen around our natural lakes and ponds as well. Most people casually visiting a northwest lake or pond may not see this pretty lily as a problem. In fact, it may add to the experience of visiting there. It truly is a beautiful plant. But fragrant water lilies pose a hidden danger. They form dense mats that can completely cover the surface of shallow lakes. These mats interfere with recreation, water movement, and native plants and animals. Fragrant water lily is valued for cultivation in containers and ornamental ponds, but poor handling of the water lily has allowed it to escape from enclosed ponds and move into natural areas. There is a growing concern that many more invasive plants and animal species will come in accompanying these orders. Why is this so bad? Well, when left unmanaged, water lilies will restrict lakefront access and eliminate swimming opportunities. The floating leaves prevent wind mixing, and extensive areas of low oxygen can develop under water lily beds during the summer, affecting fish and other animals living in these areas. Fragrant water lily can take a devastating toll on the economics of a region that relies on revenue created from water recreation. The best control of this plant is to prevent new infestations. Eurasian watermilfoil is an attractive plant with feathery underwater foliage. This aquatic plant was once commonly sold in the United States as an aquarium plant. Kathy Hamill of the Washington Department of Ecology has been working on milfoil research and control for several years.
Okay, we're standing here on the shores of Capitol Lake in Olympia, Washington, and what you see behind me is an infestation of Eurasian watermilfoil. This is an underwater plant that is causing tremendous problems in Washington State and throughout the United States. When boaters go into infested waters, they often catch little pieces of Eurasian watermilfoil and other aquatic plants. If they don't clean their boats and trailers and they launch in an uninfested area, just a very small piece of Eurasian watermilfoil can drop off and cause another infestation. Eurasian watermilfoil likes to come up and form mats on the water surface, as you can see behind us. Very, very difficult to swim through a mat like that. In fact, it's dangerous. It's a safety hazard. Very difficult to fish, to boat, to water ski. In addition to causing problems with recreational uses of a water body, Eurasian watermilfoil also causes habitat problems. These dense mats that form on the water's surface create conditions of low oxygen underneath them, and that's very poor habitat for fish. It's a very unpalatable species, and waterfowl and aquatic mammals don't particularly like to eat it.
The management of milfoil costs the state and private individuals up to $1 million per year. The biggest players in the fight against milfoil are all of us who use any lakes, rivers, or ponds for recreation. It's our job to check our equipment and make sure to remove any plant material that may be hitching a ride to our next destination. On the estuaries of the Pacific Northwest, when the tide recedes, you may often see clumps of green grass at the edge of the water. Locals call this smooth cordgrass, but its common name among weed experts is Spartina. This marine cordgrass was introduced to the region at the turn of the century by shellfish farmers who used it as packing material for oysters that were imported from the East Coast. Kyle Murphy is with the Washington State Department of Agriculture.
Spartina impacts the native ecosystem in many detrimental ways. What happens is Spartina converts the native mudflats and salt marshes into solid Spartina meadows. What this does is it destroys important shellfish habitat as well as migratory bird and waterfowl habitat. It also impacts recreational opportunities that are necessary or that rely on accessible open beaches and mudflats such as fishing, hunting, and bird watching, to name a few.
There are 4 species of Spartina classified as noxious weeds. One was intentionally introduced into the state, a good plant gone bad.
Spartina infestations start as seedlings, and these seedlings quickly grow and expand into large clumps or round clones. These clones will continue to grow at a rapid rate, growing closer together to other clones, eventually forming solid meadows of Spartina. Spartina has a very thick root mass. The Spartina root can be 5 times the size of the above ground biomass. There's a couple different ways to identify Spartina. First of all, it's a grass, so it's got a round stalk. And if you pull back the leaf and look at the base of the leaf, it has what's called a ligule of fine hairs. It's basically a band of very fine hairs at the base of each leaf.
You can get involved in educational programs around the state. There are also volunteer groups that plan Spartina pools and estuary cleanups. Noxious weeds are everyone's problem. What you need to remember is that your involvement is critical to sustain our native ecosystem and agricultural lands. The state and county noxious weed boards are set up to help the entire state. Our noxious weed laws work, but we need your help. Noxious weed management relies on input and efforts by citizens throughout the state, like you.
Here in Washington State, we have really good noxious weed laws. Each of the counties has a coordinator. If you see something that you even think is a noxious weed, it's important that you report it to the county noxious weed board so that they can check it out. Because if we don't control invasive species at the earliest stages, it becomes much more difficult and much more expensive. It's also important that citizens participate in weed pulls. Programs such as the Ivy Out program in Seattle or the No Ivy League in Portland, those types of programs are springing up all over the state. If they aren't springing up, you can start one yourself.
Your land should be important to you. Take an active role in the state of Washington's war on noxious weeds. Contact your local weed control board to find out what you can do to help preserve your favorite part of Washington.